Nabazo Kankamza, Palden Gyal, Dharamsala Lintin Dinala, Matik or Putun Kola Shali Nankin, Warren Smith Lazanyamte, in Kinala, Alamishijin. Hey everybody, welcome to Talk to Palden Gyal. Today I'm very happy to be joined by Dr. Warren Smith. This is a special interview for me because I have done over 1,000 interviews with Tibetans and Westerners in Tibetan. But today's interview is my first one in English. I believe it is important to recognize Westerners who have dedicated their whole life for Tibet cause. We should learn from them. Also, we appreciate their contribution. Dr. Smith has spent many years supporting Tibetan cause. He worked at Radio Free Asia, Tibetan Service, over 20 years, and he has written several books about Tibet, including Tibetan Nation and China as Tibet. Warren Smith, thank you very much to give me this opportunity to interview you.
Thank you, Palden.
Warren, you involved the Tibet issue for a long time, so most people who pay attention in Tibet, they know about you. But please, could you tell me a little bit about your life before you're interested in Tibet?
All right. I grew up in Tennessee. I went to school at the Air Force Academy because I thought I wanted to be a jet pilot.
Right.
Well, that didn't work out because the Vietnam War, I was opposed to that. So I left there and ended up going to Nepal.
The hippie era.
Yeah, yes, exactly. In the 1970s, I was there from 1970 to 1982. I did various jobs. I worked in the national parks. I worked up in the Everest region. I worked with Sherpas. I had a crew of Sherpa carpenters. We built houses in the national parks. So I became familiar with the Tibetan issue. But in 1982, I was back in the United States selling Tibetan carpets, as many of us did. And I met someone who told me about a language program at the University of Inner Mongolia, a Chinese language study program.
Inner Mongolia in China.
Yeah, named Mangu Dashui.
Right.
And it was cheap, and it turned out there was a good reason why it was cheap, because it was an undercover operation for Christian missionaries. I didn't know that. There were only 15 of us. 4 of us were non-missionary types. And in Inner Mongolia, I was there for about 4 months, and then I heard about visas being given to Lhasa for individual travel, and that was the first time. There'd never been any individual travel. That was in the spring of 1982.
Okay.
And they were giving visas, not in Beijing or places like that. They were giving visas, and it was sort of an experimental basis. They were doing this in 3 small towns in China, one of which was Huahaute, where the University of Inner Mongolia was. So I went to the Gonganju, or the security office, and I got myself a visa to Lhasa. So I left the program and traveled through. I went through Dunhuang and Golmud.
Yeah.
And I got stopped in Golmud and told I had to fly from there because they told me I had come. The way I had come was illegal, but once I got to Golmud, I was illegal. I was legal again because I had a permit to Lhasa.
Go to Lhasa, yeah.
So I got to Lhasa. It turned out the day I got there was the day that the Panchen Lama was giving darshan, or giving blessings at the Jokan. And so that was my first experience of Tibet.
Wow, that's amazing, really. I mean, 1982, Chinese government just opened the policy by Deng Xiaoping, and as you mentioned, Panchen Lama is in prison for 9 years. After he released, he traveled to Amdo and Lhasa. So as you mentioned, when you arrived in Lhasa, Panchen Lama was there. So what was the situation at that time in Tibet?
It was There were very few foreigners there. When I arrived, we stayed at guest house number 1, which was downtown. This was not. There were also a few tourist groups being allowed who were staying further out beyond Drepung. I think that was called guest house number 2. But the individual travelers, there were only 4 people there when I arrived. Four Westerners, and most of them were English teachers in China.
Right.
Because that was the only way you could find out about these visas that were available. Outside, all my friends in Nepal were desperate for many years to get to Tibet. You know, everybody wanted to get to Tibet, but none of them came that summer because you didn't know about it if you were in Nepal. You only knew about it if you were in China already. But Lhasa was still recovering from the Cultural Revolution.
Right.
There were no restaurants. There were no hotels for foreigners. There were hardly even any tea shops, because everything had been communized until that.
Yeah, at that time, probably all the shops, the restaurant owned by state, the government.
Yeah, there were just beginning to be a few private tea shops. And there was also, you could see the destruction from the Cultural Revolution.
Right.
Like one of the large monasteries there, what was it called?
The destructive one, the Ganden Monastery?
No, I saw Ganden later, but in Lhasa, I'm sorry, I'm forgetting the name of a very large monastery in Lhasa. But other like Meru Gompa and others that now, they still existed, but they had been partitioned off, or they were being used. One was being used as a place for a drama troupe, but there was, you could still see the destruction,
right,
from Cultural Revolution and before. And a few monasteries like Drepung was open. You could go there. Potala was open. You could just go there and stay all day. I went there and stayed, and I would just hang out with Tibetan caretakers who were in different lakangs, or just sit on the roof and look over at Lhasa. And so it was a wonderful experience, because there were so few. Lhasa hadn't become like it is now. It hadn't become modernized, and there weren't as many Chinese there. And Tibetans also, they were just experiencing this new limited freedom.
Right.
Because they had been allowed to, because of Deng Xiaoping and Hu Yaobang having visited there and declaring a new policy,
right.
liberal policy. Tibetans were optimistic, but they were careful, because they didn't trust the Chinese to not change the policy again.
Right.
So there was a really interesting atmosphere in that way.
Yeah, how long did you stay there?
I was in Lhasa for 5 months.
Wow.
Yeah, I had the world record for it. The world record.
I mean, at that time, if you stay in 5 months, I'm sure you talked to a few Tibetans. So what do you know about the Dalai Lama and in the exile community?
Oh, they knew. A few Tibetans from exile were being allowed to come back.
Right, yeah.
And I met one of them, Dolma Tempa from Pennsylvania. I met her right in front of the Jokan. And she stood out from the crowd as much as I did. You know, I'm as tall as you are. Everybody could recognize this tall foreigner.
Also like a Western foreign.
Yeah, Western.
Probably there know many people have been there. You know.
None since the 1940s.
Right.
But Dolma was from exile, and she was dressed in perfect, clean, new Palden,
right.
and chuba, not in Palden. And so she stood out as much as I did, because everybody else was still just dressed in rags.
Right, yeah.
Either they were wearing the Chinese baggy clothes, or they were wearing the old Tibetan clothes, but patched up and in bad shape. So Dolma stood out as much as I did. She approached me and asked where I was from. I said, I'm an American. She said she was an American too.
American. Okay.
And she took me, her sister and brother-in-law were living in the old Pala mansion, just off the east side of the Bar Corps. they had a partitioned off room as part of the old Pala mansion. And her brother-in-law was a painter who had been in prison. Her sister had been also in prison just because they were upper class. But now they were. He was allowed to restore some gompas that he was working at Drepung. Later, he worked at Tasilompo and other places, restoring statues and frescoes or wall paintings.
Right.
And his name was Rinchen Pinjo. So that I went and visited Dolma every day for the next 5 months, and because she was a well-known person from exile. She had worked for the government in exile. She was
in exile, then moved to the United States.
Yeah, but she was supposed to have been the first woman to work for the government in exile.
Right.
And she was well known in Lhasa also. She was known for she was a young girl in Lhasa in the 1950s, and told lots of stories about how the Chinese coming there and how Tibetans had to make a choice. Many of them, herself included, were offered to go an education in interior China.
Right.
And actually her fiance took that offer. She refused it, and they then separated forever. And that was the same with many Tibetans. Either you took the road of collaboration with the Chinese or you took the road of resistance. And if you resisted, you were identified, and later you either suffered during the 59 or you had to go into exile.
Right.
Dolma escaped into exile in 59. But Dolma was also known to, she was an attractive young woman in the 1950s, and she was known to carry a little pistol.
Really?
Yeah, a little pearl handle pistol. So all of the...
So at that time, you have a few Western in Lhasa. As you mentioned, the Dolma is from United States to Tibet.
Yeah.
Do you have some kind of restriction over there? You feel like Chinese government watch you? Or?
No, because it was, at that time, they had loosened up. And, well, I would go to Dolma's house or her sister's house every day and stay until late in the evening. And that attracted some attention. Some Tibetans from the Gonganju came and asked her, who is this foreigner who is at your house? I'm sure they thought I was a spy.
Right.
But Dolma told them, he's an American, I'm an American, and we're gonna do whatever we want,
Right.
And she was very brave, and the Tibetan Gonganju were not. They didn't pursue it. They everything was changing at that time.
Yeah.
They just let her know that what she was being watched.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting time in 1982. As you mentioned, China opened up policy, whole China, including Tibet, a little bit. So lots of Tibetan is searching their identity, what's happened to Tibet past. And next few years, as you mentioned, 1982 to 1987. So 1987, biggest demonstration happened since 1959. Can you feel that 1982, Tibetans like searching something, they're going to happen to some kind of demonstration?
No, in 82, no, you couldn't feel that, because the cause of the demonstrations in 1987 was because the Chinese changed their policy. Like when Hu Yaobang came there, he promised to reduce the number of Chinese in Tibet by 85%. And everybody was talking about that. Everybody used the same number, 85%. And you could actually see from the guest house where I was staying, you could see buses of Chinese leaving every day, and all of them carrying as much stuff as they could take from Tibet. So at that, and from 82 to 84, basically there was this period of relative freedom. In 84, they changed their policy and decided for economic development they needed more Chinese in Tibet.
Right.
And so that began to increase Tibetan dissatisfaction.
Yeah.
But Doma, I have to tell you the story. Doma, all of these people were coming to Doma and telling their stories of their suffering during the past.
What's happened, yeah.
Yes, because they trusted her, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And they would give her letters to take to their relatives in exile because they didn't trust the official post office.
Mm-hmm.
And so Doma told me that she would tell me what was being told to her. She would tell me all of this, and the deal was that if I would write a book about Tibet, she would tell me all this stuff.
Okay, tell me a little bit of what she told you at that time.
It was just about, everybody was talking about Natchen Trong, because all of the Tibetan upper class had been sent out to work on the hydroelectric at Natchen Trong, and they were told about how they were made to work, and also, and none of them were guilty of anything. They hadn't actually participated in the revolt in 59. They were just guilty of being upper class, and they were persecuted in that way. And others, even Doma's former fiance showed up, and he told about how, you know, he had taken the opportunity to go study in China and had become a low-level cadre. And he came and he talked to her, and I sat there and listened to all of it. But he was very, you know, like all of the Tibetans who worked for the Chinese, he was very careful.
Right.
Whereas other Tibetans, the ones who had suffered, many of them said, we're not afraid anymore because we've suffered so much. We're not afraid because what else can they do to us? You know?
Right, yeah.
Well,
so when did you left Tibet? Then what did you do? I mean, as you mentioned, Dharamsala, and you have a deal, you're going to write about the book. So did you keep the promise?
Yes, Doma, I actually was able to get on a bus going to Nepal.
Mm-hmm.
I went to the Nepalese embassy and told them I was actually a resident of Nepal. And the consular officer there was somebody who actually lived in my neighborhood in Kathmandu and who recognized me. So he gave me a letter saying that I was a resident of Nepal, and I was able to get on a bus for Tibetans who were visiting from Nepal.
Right.
When in Kathmandu, then I went with Doma to Dharamsala.
Mm-hmm.
And she introduced me to everybody. She arranged everything, and I then began study of.
So when was it in Dharamsala?
I was there at the end of 1982 for 6 months at that time.
Wow, what's like Dharamsala at that time in Tibetan exile community?
Dharamsala was great because there also there was an atmosphere. Things were changing.
Right.
Of course, the Tibetans were a little bit unrealistic. A lot of them were studying Chinese, thinking that things were going to change to such an extent that they were going to be able to go back. And, you know, they would need Chinese language. But, I mean, that didn't happen. But there were also quite a number of foreigners that were starting to come to Dharamsala for political studies that are historical or anthropological, that kind of thing, not just the Dharma kind of people,
right,
who usually were not very interested in politics.
Yeah.
So there was a great atmosphere in Dharamsala. You met all kinds of interesting people.
Yeah, I heard at that time all the inches like happy inches, like really like they're searching for some kind of happiness and art or these kind of things.
Right. That was true. I was sort of a hippie, but I wasn't one of those religious seekers. I was interested in politics. I was, and still am, I'm strictly about the politics. But then there I met people like Tashi Sering and Jamyang Norbu, who from whom I learned a lot, you know, about what was the real situation, both inside Tibet and in Dharamsala.
Okay.
And then I began, I went, did 6 months in Dharamsala, then another 6 months later, another 4 months after that. And then came back to the United States and decided I wanted to write.
Right.
this book.
Okay, we can talk your book in later. Before we talk your book, I want to ask you about Nepal. You live in Nepal 1970s. At that time, Tibetans came to exile, like 10 years ago, we can say. But you lived there for 10 years. What's like Tibetan exile community situation at that time in Nepal?
There were a lot of very interesting Tibetans there at that time. They were opening shops in Tamil and places like that. And I was there in 1975 during the coronation of King Virendra. And at that time, that was when the Nepal army went up and disarmed the Kampas in Mustang.
Mm-hmm.
And there was an exhibition on the Tundakel in Kathmandu of all the weapons that the Kampas had had.
Oh.
And they all said made in the United States.
Right.
But the Nepal government said, oh, well, they could have been bought on the international arms market. So they didn't want to have to blame the Americans for all of that. But that was when with foreigners in Nepal, you gravitated towards the Tibetans because the Nepalese people weren't as open as the Tibetans. The Nepalese people weren't as interesting as the Tibetans. Their religion and their culture wasn't as interesting to Westerners as the Tibetan culture and religion were. So and the Tibetans are just more friendly and more cosmopolitan in a way. First of all, most of the exiles in the ones who in Lhasa tended to be the upper classes. There were also refugee camps and places in Lhasa and other places where usually more lower class Tibetans were, but a lot of the upper class had located in Lhasa, and they had shops and carpet shops and whatnot.
Yeah, thank you, Warren. You said after Dharamsala, you came back to United States, yeah? Which should be 1983 or 4, yeah. At that time, talk me a little bit about in Americans. How much do they know about Tibet?
There was interest in Tibet in the United States at that time, but I found there was the type of people who were interested in Tibet were also quite unrealistic. They imagined that, and I had a different attitude. My whole experience of Tibet came from Nepal and Tibet and Dharamsala. The Americans who were interested in Tibet usually didn't have that kind of experience. And they imagined that as soon as they, as Americans, got involved in this issue, the Chinese would listen to them and something would happen. So they were, and well, Tibetans tend to be a little bit prone to wishful thinking as well. So a lot of the NGs in America who got involved in the Tibet issue were like that. But I wasn't one of those. I was more, I would say, pragmatic and objective, I think. And I wanted to study the issue. I went back to school to study the issue.
Right. Warren Smith, thank you very much for your interview. The second part, we talk about your study and your books, and you work the RFA Tibetan Service. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Palden.
Thank you, everybody, to watching this interview. If you want to listen and watch thoughtful discussion about Tibet, please subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you.